To start a new series of messages for Advent, and we want to study the book of Ruth together. And some of you might say, well, why would you study the book of Ruth during Advent? Well, it's because you need to think about where the story took place. It took place in Bethlehem, and it was the story that prepared the way for Jesus to come. If Ruth hadn't done what she did, physically speaking, we wouldn't have had Jesus come. So this is a story that prepares the way for Jesus. And I want to begin this morning by talking to you about tragedy. Tragedy has a way of raising its ugly head around Christmas time. I don't know if you've experienced it, but I have a dear friend in Modesto who called me up one time, and I was on the way to a Christmas celebration, and he phoned me, and my wife got the cell phone message, and the message was that my friend had found his mom dead of a heart attack on the kitchen floor that morning. And for him, every time Christmas comes around, it's a sad memory of finding his mom collapsed on the floor. So tragedy has its way of raising its ugly head around Christmas time. It may be something that happened during the season itself, or it may be a memory of something that happened earlier during that year that comes back to haunt us at this time. Does the Lord have something to say to us about tragedy? And I would like to suggest to you that he does. And I want to read for you a longer portion. I want to read to you the whole first chapter of the book of Ruth. So relax, enjoy. This is a story that we're going to try to learn from this morning. Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they had been there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who would become your husbands? Return home, my daughters." I'm sorry. Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband, even if I thought there was still hope for me. Even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. And at this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. May God bless this reading of his word. And I want to encourage you to come each week, because each week I will read another chapter of this story. It's kind of like story time for older boys and girls. And we will finish the book of Ruth together before Christmas. Today I want us to focus on 3 tragedies that occurred in the life of Ruth and Naomi. 3 tragedies occurred. First of all, there was a famine in the land of Judah. Elimelech was a man who came from Bethlehem in Judah. Bethlehem, the very word Bethlehem, means house of bread. And it's very ironic that there would have been a famine, no bread, in the house of bread. What was going on at that time? Well, it's very interesting that the text begins with some words that are sometimes overlooked. In the days when the judges ruled. That is a specific period of time that the author is referring to, and it was a 200-year period when God had sent judges to the people of Israel. It was after the time of Moses, after the time of Joshua. The people had settled in the land, but the people were not listening to God. The people were doing their own thing. Everyone did what was right in their own mind. Sounds a little bit like us, huh? And during that time, there was a cycle that took place. And it's outlined in Judges chapter 2. There was a cycle of 5 progressions. The first one was Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. That was the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened was the Lord sent poverty, famine, and war. The third thing that happened was Israel repented of her evil ways. And the fourth thing that happened was the Lord sent judges to deliver them. And the fifth thing that happened was then Israel again experienced peace and prosperity. So it was like a cycle down into disobedience, and then repentance brought prosperity. Disobedience, poverty, obedience, prosperity. It's kind of like a wheel that went. And that cycle is given 13 times in the book of Judges. It happened over and over and over again. So when you know about that cycle, and you read that there was famine in the house of bread in Bethlehem in Judah, what part of the cycle were they in? They were in the part of the cycle when they had been disobedient to God, and they were facing the famine as a result of their disobedience to God. So, Elimelech is trying to deal with the famine, and it seems like a very noble thing for a man who cares about his family to leave his place of residence because there was a famine there, and to go over to the land of Moab, except for the fact that Moab was a place that the people of Israel had been warned not to go. Why were they warned not to go there? They were warned not to go there because the people of Moab worshipped other gods. And the Lord didn't want his people to go and worship other gods in the other places where people lived. So for Elimelech to go to Moab was to compromise. He had a good intention, most likely, to take care of his family and their physical needs, but it was compromising to get the food and the well-being by going to a place where they worshiped other gods and being influenced by those people. So the people of Moab did not worship the God of Israel. Was Elimelech wrong to leave Bethlehem and go there? We are not specifically told, but it seems to us like it was a compromise. Let's remember this: when we move away from God's people, we are headed into trouble. I know people who used to attend this church, but who have faced tragedy in their lives, and they will never go back to church again. That's the wrong response, brothers and sisters. We don't respond to tragedy by staying away from God and away from church. We respond to tragedy by being brought closer to God and closer to his people. That's the way it should be. So the first tragedy was that there was a famine in the land of Judah. The second tragedy is in verse 3 and 4. There was a death in the family. Elimelech died. He left Naomi in Moab with 2 sons. Can you imagine the pain that Naomi must have been going through? Here she up and left her home, the place where she was comfortable, and she went to a new place and tried to get adjusted to new way of living in Moab. And while she's in this strange country that they were hoping they would only be there for a little while, her husband dies. And with her husband, her hope died that they would be able to go back immediately. So it says that they stayed in Moab for 10 years. That's a pretty long time to go away from home. For 10 years they stayed there, and during those 10 years, the 2 sons that they had married Moabite women. There's another yellow flag. The first yellow flag was to go to Moab, where they worshipped other gods. The second yellow flag was their two sons married Moabite women. The people of God were not supposed to marry outside their faith. And the people of Moab were not believers in the true and living God. So there was a problem. God did not want them to marry outside their faith, but Mahlon married Ruth, and Chilion married Orpah, and these mixed marriages lasted for at least 10 years. Then the third tragedy struck. The first tragedy, do you remember? Famine. The second tragedy, the death of Elimelech. And the third tragedy, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. Can you imagine the sorrow in that family? 3 widows in one family. Naomi was left without a husband and without a son. In that day and age, to be left without a husband and without a son was an extreme tragedy because it meant that there was no heritage, no lineage, nothing that would follow after Naomi would die. It was a difficult situation. How could she cope? Well, then we get to the way that these 3 ladies responded to these 3 tragedies. First of all, I told you about 3 tragedies. Now I'm going to talk about 3 responses. The first response was the response of Naomi. And there were 3 scenes that happened. First of all, in verse 6 and 7, Naomi was still in the land of Moab. She heard news from Bethlehem that the Lord had come to the aid of his people. Remember that cycle I talked about at the first? The cycle was that the people did evil, and then they went down into famine, and then the Lord would send a judge, and then they would repent from their sin, and then they would do better, be better off financially and physically. Well, that cycle had taken place, and now the people of Judah, and specifically the land of Bethlehem, were doing better. The Lord had come to the aid of his people. So Naomi had in her heart that she wanted to go back to Bethlehem. Let me go back home where I used to live and where I used to be loved and know God's people. I want to go back. So she prepared to go home. And she set off for home with her 2 daughters-in-law. They were going back to the land of Judah, to the place called Bethlehem. But then in verses 8 to 18, they were on the road to Bethlehem, and they have this conversation. Naomi is feeling bad. She's not feeling bad necessarily for others. She's feeling bad for herself. And when she feels bad for herself, she says to herself, how am I going to take care of my daughters-in-law? I don't have a husband. I don't have children. I don't have anything to support these 2 daughters-in-laws. What am I going to do? So Naomi says to herself, I'm going to just tell them to go back to Moab. That's their home. I'm going back to my home, and I'm going to tell them to go back to their home because it's all useless. God has been mean to me. God has destroyed my dreams and my hopes. I'm going to give up. So Naomi tells her daughters-in-law that they should go back to Moab. And I want you to notice that in saying to go back to Moab, you weren't only saying go back to a country, you were also saying go back to your old faith, your old way of living. She told her daughters to go back to Moab, but the daughters wanted to stay with Naomi. And then Naomi insisted that her daughters-in-law would return home. And it tells us that Orpah, by the way, not Oprah, but Orpah went back to Moab. And I want you to notice that when she went back to Moab, she went back to her gods. They worshiped many. They didn't worship the God of Israel. They worshiped many foreign gods. And when Orpah went back, she went back to her gods. But Ruth was different. Ruth clung to Naomi, and she would not go back. And that's where we have this wonderful commitment that Ruth makes. She says, where you go, I'm going to go. Where you stay, I'm going to stay. Your people will be my people. And listen to this one. Your God, Jehovah, Yahweh in heaven, your God will be my God. She was making a spiritual commitment to Naomi and to Naomi's God. When they arrived in Bethlehem, verses 19 to 21, the whole town was stirred up because of them. And the women of the town asked this question, "Oh, my lands, is this Naomi?" They were so glad to see her. But the very name Naomi means pleasant. "Oh, my lands, is this the pleasant one come back to home?" And Naomi couldn't stand it. Her heart's getting more bitter and more bitter all the time. And she says, "Don't call me pleasant one, call me bitter, because that's who I am." She blamed God for her circumstances. Listen to what she says. These are her words. "The Lord has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. The Lord has afflicted me. It's all God's fault." And Naomi was bitter, and she was shaking her fist in the face of God. Do you know there are some people like that today? There are some people who have gone through difficult times in their lives. And all of us should be compassionate with people who go through difficult times in their lives. Some of us here have gone through difficult times in our lives. But one of the ways to respond to going through difficult times in your life is to allow yourself to become bitter against God. You don't want to hear about him. You don't want to read about him. You don't want to be with his people. Church did me wrong. God did me wrong. I'm out of here. And there are people who used to go to this church who feel like that. And the only thing we can do is pray that God would change their hearts. The other thing we can do is we can watch our own hearts. Never allow yourself to get bitter against God. You're free to ask God questions, but don't allow yourself to become hardened and bitter, because that's extremely selfish. So we've seen several responses so far. First of all, Naomi's response, became bitter. Second, we saw Orpah's response. What did she do? She decided to go back. We use the term backsliding. Christianity didn't do any good for me, so I'm going to backslide into the way that I used to live before I went to church. You can be a Christian and get bitter, or you can have gone to church and backslide. But then there's one more option, and that's what Ruth did. How did Ruth respond? She had tragedy in her life too. Her husband died. Her father-in-law died. She went through the very same experience that Naomi and that Orpah went through. But Ruth responded in a much better way. She made a commitment to Naomi. She made a commitment to God's people. And she made a commitment to God. Listen again to the words of verse 16 and 17. Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you," that's to Naomi, "don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." That's what we do when tragedy strikes. We don't cut loose and go back home and backslide to our old way of life. We don't allow ourselves to get bitter. We commit ourselves to God and say, the only way I'm going to make it through this tragic situation is to cling to the cross of Jesus with all I've got. That's how a Christian responds to tragedy. They put God first. And I don't know about you, but I've seen each of these responses enacted in people's lives during the time that I've been a pastor. I've seen people get bitter, and it destroys their lives. I've seen people go back to acting as if they weren't Christians at all, and it destroys their lives. And I've seen people who have gone through tragedy commit themselves to cling to God with all they have, and their lives become sweet and beautiful, like a fragrant perfume of glory and praise to God. Can I tell you about a friend of mine? His name was Art Sunbow. He's in heaven now. Art Sunbow was married and had many children, several children, about 6 or 7. And Art Sunbow had a difficult situation because during the time he was married to his first wife, of the 7 children, they lost 5 of them through death. One was a car accident. One was infant mortality. One of them was cancer. It was and I have this little story. It's all written down by his first wife. It's called Treasures in Heaven. And she's telling the story of how God brought them through a difficult time in their marriage when they lost so many of their children. But God was there for them. He kept them through the difficult time. And God changed their lives. And I met Art Sunbo. He was in his 70s and I was in my 20s. And we did a trip together for the Bible college that I was part of. He was representing the college and I was on a singing team. And that man was the sweetest, most generous person you could ever meet. And I sat with him one time while we were driving home, and I said, "What makes you so gentle, so kind, so pleasant to be with?" And he says, "I was pretty gruff when I started out. But when you go through pain and you rely on God, He changes you on the inside." And if God could use something like pain and tragedy to change Art Sunbo to the loving, gentle, kind, grandfatherly man he became, couldn't God do the same for us? Sometimes God uses tragedy to mold us into the image of his Son, Jesus. So my message for you this morning is to follow the example of Ruth and not the example of Orpah and not the example of Naomi. But when tragedy strikes, put God first and let him change you into the kind of person he wants you to be. When tragedy strikes, put God first. The whole book of Ruth is an everyday living example of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. When tragedy strikes, put God first.